We all know and love the epic cinematics of Dune. The massive sandworms, the sweeping dunes, the sheer scale of it all, it's breathtaking. But there's always been one thing that bothered me. Why is it that we never get to see a sandworm and a person in one perfect epic shot? You know, like those posters or fan art that captures the sheer scale of these monstrous creatures compared to a human. Even in the unforgettable scene where Paul Atreides rides the sandworm for the first time, it's, well, let's just say it's more dust than a worm. And that got me thinking, what if I made the shot myself? A shot where you can see the sandworm and the person together in all their glory. Today we're jumping into the 3D program Blender to recreate that iconic image. Will it work or will I fail? Let's find it out. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, but more on that later. The first thing I wanted to tackle was the dust and smoke simulation for the sandworm bursting out of the ground. I hopped over to Sketchfab and after a few minutes of searching I found a perfect sandworm model. It was detailed, imposing and surprise, it was already rigged. Once I imported it into Blender I ran into a bit of an issue. Every time I tried to move the bones on the rig I kept running into an error message. Super frustrating, right? But after a quick search I figured it out. Turns out you need to select the armature and switch from rest position to pose position. Simple, but if you don't know, it can drive you nuts. So if you ever run into this problem, now you know how to fix it. Once that was sorted, I animated the sandworm shooting up from beneath the ground. Since I'm only aiming for a still image in the end, the animation doesn't need to be perfect, just good enough to nail the motion for the simulation. Next up, the smoke simulation. Here's how I set it up. Add a cube and position it above the worm so the worm can break through it. Then hit F3 and search for quick smoke. This creates all the basic components you need for the simulation. The domain cube is the container where the simulation happens, so make sure to scale it up to fit the action in it. To make the worm interact with the smoke, add a fluid modifier to the worm and set it to Effector. Easy enough, right? After that, hit spacebar and play the simulation, and boom, dust and smoke everywhere. With just a few parameter tweaks, I was already getting some solid results. While testing, I left the resolution at 32 for fast previews, but for the final cache, I bumped it up to 64 or even 128 for a sharper, more realistic look. Here's a pro tip: things always look more realistic in 3D when you layer different effects on top of each other. So I created 4 variations of the smoke simulation, tweaking parameters each time to make it look unique. When they are combined, the result is much richer and more dynamic. And just like that, the sandworm bursting out of the ground is starting to come to life. We're one step closer to that epic shot. The scenery. How could it be different? Of course, it had to be some Majestic Dunes to capture the true Dune vibe. But honestly, I had no idea how to tackle creating that environment from scratch. That's when I found an incredible guide on Skillshare by Yassine Larayef and all about creating beautiful realistic dunes in Blender. It was a total game changer for this project and honestly I wouldn't have been able to make this environment without it. That brings me to today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives like us. They offer thousands of classes taught by industry experts in categories like illustration, graphic design, animation, music, marketing, you name it. Whether you're just starting out or looking to go pro, Skillshare makes it easy to pick up new skills or level up your passions. Plus, they recently introduced Learning Paths, curated collections of classes that guide you step by step to mastering a specific skill. For this project, it was all about learning 3D landscape creation, but Skillshare isn't just for Blender enthusiasts, even though they have a lot of great classes for Blender, VFX and 3D art. But you can also find other courses in photography, music, productivity and even entrepreneurship. There's something for everyone. And the best part is the first 500 people to use the link in the description will get 1 month of Skillshare for free. It's a perfect way to kickstart your creative habit, so what are you waiting for? Click the link below and get started today. Now let's continue with the artwork. I don't want to get too technical here, but let me give you a quick overview of how I created the Dune texture. The key is to work in cycles and experimental mode. Why? Because we're using adaptive subdivision to keep render times fast and avoid unnecessary geometry. So no need to model all the dunes manually. First, in the render settings, set the dicing rate for rendering to 2 pixels and the viewport to 4. Lower numbers mean better quality. Also bump the off-screen scale to 10, so anything outside of your camera frame isn't calculated in full detail. Trust me, this saves a ton of lag. Next, create a plane, scale it up to about 200 meters and add a material. Set the surface to displacement only because, yep, you guessed it, we're using the displacement node in the shadings tab. The principle is simple. Add a Voronoi texture, tweak the parameters and plug it into the displacement node. For more variation, mix in additional noise or Voronoi textures using a mix color node. Once I had my main dunes looking good, I grouped all of the nodes with Ctrl G, a lifesaver for keeping things organized. To add smaller waves to the sand, I used another Voronoi texture, stretched it with the mapping node and mixed it into the main group. This layering technique creates the natural wind-blown look. To scatter rocks in the sand, I built another node tree. If you want a full step-by-step process, check out the Skillshare class I mentioned earlier, it's all explained in details there. For the sand texture, I blended 2 shades of orange, darker for lower points and light for higher ones, controlled with the set value. The rocks are added with a mix node, driven by our rock group and fine-tuned with a color ramp. I know that was a lot to take in, but for this project the environment was absolutely make or break. Now that it's done, we can move on to the fun part, the composition. To start pulling the composition together, I moved the camera back for the wide shot of the dunes. After rendering that out, I expanded the image downward in Photoshop. This expanded version was duplicated back into Blender to give the illusion of a massive desert stretching far into the horizon. It's a great time saver for rendering and honestly no one will ever notice. Next, I began to populate the scene. I found a 3D model of Paul Atreides, our hero, and the small device used to summon the sandworm. With these elements in place, it was time to bring in the star of the show, the sandworm and its smoke simulations. Now here's where things got frustrating. Somehow my smoke simulations had been deleted, so I had to recreate them from scratch. But honestly, it worked out for the best. This time I added a dynamic animation of the worm moving in from the side, which made the smoke look much more turbulent and alive. Once I gave the smoke an orange tone, the scene really started to come together. In the movies, Paul always had claws hanging from his back, so I quickly modeled one with a plane. By selecting a few points in edit mode and assigning them to a vertex group, I was able to pin the cloth using the cloth modifier. It fell naturally while staying attached at the top points. Then I duplicated it and added a wind force to create a beautiful wind-blown effect. And of course, I couldn't forget Dune's iconic twin moons. I added them in the background for that extra cinematic flair, though I'll admit I debated whether they were overkill, but hey, sometimes more is more. With the scene fully built, all that was left was render it out and make some final color corrections in Photoshop. A little tweaking here, a little adjustment there, and it's done. So, are you ready to see the final image? This project was a roller coaster of challenges and breakthroughs, but I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. From the dunes to the smoke, from the sandworm to the little details like Paul's flowing cloth. Every piece came together to create a moment that feels straight out of Dune. Let me know what you think of the final shot and if you would like to see more creative projects like this. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Until next time, stay creative and keep pushing boundaries.